Eleanor Fairfax stood in the drive of Rendlesham Park, with her writing box balanced on her knees, and she did not weep. She did not send a servant in after him. She did not smooth her skirts or check the angle of her bonnet in the window glass, the way a woman does when she still hopes to be found beautiful by someone who has forgotten to look. She sat on the stone bench beside the unopened doors, and she opened the brass clasp of the box her mother had left her. And she took out a pen and a fresh sheet and began, in a hand that did not shake, to write down the names of every guest who arrived while she waited, and the hour each one came. Because if no one else in that county would keep an honest record of this day, she would. By the second hour the shadows had swung clean across the drive, and the coachman had begun exchanging looks over the horses' backs, and the Duke of Rendlesham had not come out to receive his own bride at the reception meant to present her to Milestone as its new duchess. When at last the doors opened, it was not for her. It was guests, arriving in twos and threes, stepping around her as though she were a piece of garden statuary the family had not yet decided where to place. She rose. She greeted them herself, by name, as if she had planned it this way all along, and something in the county's collective face recalibrated slightly, the way people's faces do when they realise they are witnessing a thing they will be asked to describe later. By nightfall, when the Duke finally came looking for his wife among his own guests, she was 3 miles down the turnpike road, on foot, the writing box under her arm, and she never told a single soul in Milestone why. The summer of 1816 had come to Milestone the way it always did, heavy with hay dust and indifferent to the arrangements of men, and it was in that thick, unhurried season that Thomas Fairfax's daughter had married a duke. It was not, whatever the county assumed, a love match, and it was not, whatever the county also assumed, a mercenary one on her side. Eleanor's father had built his fortune in wool the slow, patient way, buying flocks nobody wanted, breeding them clean, keeping ledgers so precise that factors 2 counties over sent for his advice before they trusted their own arithmetic. He had raised his daughter at the same desk, and by 19 she could read a rent roll the way other girls read novels, for the story hidden in it. What Rendlesham needed when Julian Hartwell's father died and left the dukedom with drainage unmended and debts quietly accumulating behind a fine house was not another ornamental bride. It needed capital, and it needed someone who understood what capital was for. Thomas Fairfax's money and his daughter's competence came in the same contract, and everyone signed it with their eyes open, and nobody asked whether the 2 people at the centre of it might come, eventually, to feel something for one another. That question belonged to a later part of the story than anyone thought to write down. Julian Hartwell was 31, correct in all things, and cold in a manner people mistook for breeding. He managed his estate the way a man manages a wound he has stopped noticing, competently and at a distance. His mother had left Rendlesham when he was 12, gone one autumn morning with a trunk, and a note his father burned before Julian could finish reading it, and the old Duke's only comment on the matter, delivered once and never repeated, had shaped his son more thoroughly than any inheritance of land. Attachment, the old Duke said, is a debt a man extends at his own risk, and the wise man keeps his affections in the same ledger as his other liabilities, small insured and never allowed to compound. Julian had absorbed this the way a boy absorbs anything said to him, by a father who never says much. He had grown into a man who managed his wife the way he managed his tenants, fairly, attentively, and from behind a wall he had built so early he no longer remembered building it. Eleanor had known, marrying him, that she was not marrying a man in love with her. She had not expected, in the 6 months since the wedding, that she would come to understand the shape of his silence so well she could predict it, knew when he retreated into the estate office to avoid a conversation, knew that he answered kindness with a kind of startled formality, as though warmth were a language he had once spoken fluently and had since had to relearn from a phrasebook. She had begun, without quite admitting it to herself, to catalogue the small thaws, the evening he had passed her the good pen without being asked, the afternoon he had stood a full minute at her study door before knocking, the way he had once, only once, laughed, briefly, at something she said about a stubborn ram, and then looked so unsettled by his own laughter that he had left the room. She had begun keeping those in a private ledger too, the kind with no numbers in it, though she would have called anyone a liar who suggested she did. She had also begun, quietly and without his knowledge, doing the work his steward could not or would not do. The Rendlesham home farm had been losing hay to standing water in the low meadows for 3 summers running, and no one had thought to ask why, because the man responsible for asking, Mr. Silas Dunmore, had been managing the estate for 20 years on habit rather than method, and habit had stopped working sometime around the year the old Duke died. Eleanor had walked the low meadows herself, in boots she was not, strictly, meant to own, and had found the old drainage culverts silted to uselessness, and had said nothing to her husband about it, because she had learned already that the fastest way to make Julian Hartwell defensive was to hand him a problem he had not noticed on his own land. The garden reception that would become the day the whole county spoke of had been meant in its planning as a small correction to that silence, an occasion on which Julian would present her properly, at last, as his duchess rather than his contract. She had chosen her dress for it with more care than she liked to admit. She had not expected Aldous Creed. Creed was the old Duke's nephew, and had been, before Eleanor's dowry arrived to complicate the mathematics of inheritance, the presumptive heir to a title that carried considerably more prestige than income. He was warm in company, the way poured cream is warm, smooth, agreeable, and entirely without the heat that would make it dangerous to the touch until it was too late to notice the burn. He had spent the morning of the reception manufacturing a crisis, a tenant dispute over a boundary hedge that did not, in fact, exist in the form he described it, timed precisely to draw Julian into the estate office an hour before the guests arrived, and to keep him there. Julian had gone, because a dispute among his tenants was, to him, a more legible emergency than his wife standing alone in a drive full of strangers. He had told himself he would be a quarter of an hour. He had been 2 hours, and some part of him, the part trained since boyhood to treat every human obligation as a line item, had reasoned, while Creed talked in slow circles about a hedge that moved position every time he described it, that Eleanor would manage. She always managed. That, in the end, was precisely the problem, though it would be a long while yet before he understood it was one. It was in the drawing-room, an hour into her wait, that Julian's aunt, Lady Augusta Hartwell, found him briefly free of Creed and said what she said, not knowing the garden door stood open 6 feet away, not knowing his bride sat just beyond it with a writing-box on her knees and nothing to occupy her hands but a pen. "The county will ask," Lady Augusta said, "why your bride stands alone in the drive while you sit in here with Hedges." "She is suitable," Julian said. He said it the way a man reads a figure off a page he has already checked twice. "She will not make a scene. She keeps the household books better than my last steward kept the estates. I do not require more of her than that." There was a silence after it. Lady Augusta, to her credit, looked briefly uncomfortable, though not so uncomfortable as to close the door. Outside, Eleanor did not move. She did not set down the pen. She finished the sentence she had been writing. The Dowager Lady Pell arrived at 4:30, unaccompanied, and only then did she permit herself 10 minutes. Counted against the little clock in the hall, she could just hear through the glass, to feel the sentence Julian had spoken as fully as it deserved to be felt. 10 minutes. She had learned, somewhere in the 2 years since her mother died, that grief unrationed became a room a woman could not find her way out of again, and she had promised herself she would never again enter a room without knowing where the door was. When the 10 minutes ended, she closed the drawer in her mind where the sentence now lived, folded it the way she folded linen, and stood to greet the next arriving carriage as though she had never heard a word of it. She hosted the reception herself. She was, guests would say afterward, remarkably composed for a bride abandoned at her own presentation. Composed in a way that unsettled people more than tears would have, because tears could be comforted, and this could not. When Julian finally emerged, flushed with the particular irritation of a man who has just realized he has been made a fool of over a hedge that does not exist, he found his wife receiving the last of the guests with an ease that made him, for one disorienting moment, wonder whether she had needed him there at all. She said nothing to him of the wait. She smiled at the guests who remained, and refused the offer of the carriage when the last of them had gone, and walked out through the front gate of Rendlesham Park onto the turnpike road, with her writing box under her arm, 3 miles, in slippers not made for it, and did not look back to see whether he watched her go. He did watch. He stood in the drive for a long time after she had gone, in the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes, and found for the first time in longer than he could account for that the sum would not come out even. The first person to hear anything true about that evening was not Julian, and not Lady Augusta, and not the county, which spent the following fortnight inventing its own version with considerable enthusiasm. It was Silas Dunmore, the Rendlesham land steward, who found the new Duchess the next morning standing in the low meadow, with her boots already muddy to the ankle, studying the silted mouth of a culvert as though it had personally wronged her. "Your Grace ought not be out here alone," Dunmore said. He was a broad, weathered man of 50 some years, who had buried 2 wives and outlived his patience for polite fictions, and he said what he thought, which was rare enough among Rendlesham's staff to count as a form of honesty in itself. "I am not alone," Eleanor said. "I have a spade leaning against that fence-post, and I intend to use it if you will not fetch me a man who can dig faster than I." Dunmore looked at her for a long moment, looked at the culvert, looked at her again. "You know what that is, then?" he said. "I know it's the reason this meadow floods every June, and every tenant on it loses 1/3 of his hay," Eleanor said. "I know it's been silted 3 years, which means somebody noticed it silting in the first year, and decided it was cheaper to say nothing than to clear it. I should like to know which somebody that was, though I expect I already do." Dunmore did not answer that directly, which was itself an answer. He crossed his arms and studied her with something that was not quite respect yet, but was no longer quite dismissal either. "His Grace won't thank you for digging up his steward's failures," he said. "His Grace need not thank me for anything," Eleanor said. "I should like the hay saved. The tenants will want their rents to mean something more this autumn than a landlord's excuse for why they mean less." She did not tell him about the drawing-room door, or the 10 minutes, or the sentence folded away in the drawer of her mind. She told him about drainage, because drainage was a problem with an answer, and answers were the only country she cared to occupy that week. Within 3 days she had walked every culvert on the home farm, with a boy from the village paid $1 to hold her measuring line, and had drawn up, in her own hand, a plan to clear 400 yards of blocked drain before the autumn rains, at a cost she calculated to the shilling and presented to Dunmore before she presented it to anyone else. Because she had learnt already that a plan survived contact with a sceptical man best when it arrived already proven rather than merely proposed. £12, 4 shillings, Dunmore said, reading it over. For 400 yards. £11.10, if we use the estate's own men instead of hiring from Larch Hollow, and I see no reason not to, since half the estate's own men are sitting idle this fortnight, waiting on the wheat to ripen. Dunmore read the figures twice. He had managed men and land long enough to recognise competence when it was placed in front of him in a woman's careful hand, and long enough also to recognise that recognising it would cost him something in pride he had not expected to spend that week. "I'll want to see the drain lines myself before I put men to it," he said. "I should be disappointed in you if you didn't," Eleanor said, and something that was almost a smile moved briefly across Dunmore's weathered face before he remembered himself, and put it away. It took 3 weeks. In the end, not the fortnight she had budgeted, because the second culvert proved worse than the first, and required stone rather than clearing. But by the 3rd week, the low meadow drained clean for the first time since before the old Duke's final illness, and the tenants who worked it, men who had lost hay money 3 summers running and said nothing about it, because complaining to a Duke's steward had never once produced anything but promises, began, without any instruction from anyone, to speak of the new Duchess in the particular tone people use for someone they have decided, cautiously, to trust. Julian noticed the change before he understood its cause. He noticed it the way he noticed weather, as an ambient fact rather than a story with a heroine. Tenants who had once touched their hats to him with the flat courtesy of men performing a duty began, that autumn, to mention the Duchess unprompted, admiringly, in the particular way that meant something specific had happened and had not yet reached him directly. It was Dunmore, eventually, cornered in the estate office over a wholly unrelated matter of fencing, who told him about the culverts, and about the £12 that had become £11.10, and about the boy paid $1 to hold a measuring line. "She never told you," Julian said. "It was not quite a question." "Didn't ask her opinion on whether she should," Dunmore said. "She saw a problem. She fixed it. Struck me she does most things that way." Julian said nothing to that for a long moment. He was thinking, though he would not have said so aloud, of the drawing-room door, and of the sentence he had spoken through it, and of how it must have sounded to a woman who fixed problems without waiting to be asked, while her husband sat 2 rooms away discussing a hedge that had never existed. He began, after that, to watch her more closely than he let himself admit. He noticed the way she took her tea, always at the same hour, always with the same small silence beforehand that he came, eventually, to recognise as a kind of private accounting, though he did not yet know what she was counting. He noticed that she never asked him for anything, not money, not attention, not explanation, and that this had once struck him as a mercy, and now struck him, uneasily, as something closer to a verdict. He found himself, one evening in October, standing outside her study door for a full minute before he knocked, the way a man stands outside a room he is no longer certain he has the right to enter, and when she called him in and he asked, stiffly, whether she required anything for the coming winter accounts, She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not read, and said only, "No, thank you," and he left feeling that he had failed some test he had not known he was sitting. It was Lady Augusta, of all people, who first spoke to him plainly about his mother. "You think," she said, one evening when Eleanor had retired early and Julian sat alone with his aunt over the last of the wine, "that if you do not ask anything of a wife, she cannot take anything from you when she leaves." Julian did not answer that directly either. It was a family trait, apparently, not answering things directly, though he was beginning to suspect it was not a virtue. "My mother did not leave because my father asked too much of her," Lady Augusta said. "She left because he asked nothing at all, for years, and mistook that for kindness, the way you are mistaking it now." "You were not there," Julian said. "I was 22 and living in this house," Lady Augusta said. "I was very much there. I watched your father love her the only way he knew how to love anyone, which was to make certain she wanted for nothing and required of her nothing in return, and I watched her come to feel, over years, entirely unnecessary. A woman who feels unnecessary does not always leave in body, Julian. Sometimes she only leaves in the ways that matter, and stays in the house as a kind of ghost, keeping your books and pouring your tea, and being, forever, suitable." The word landed on him the way a name called across a room lands on a man who thought no one had seen him standing there. He set down his glass with more care than the gesture required. "I did not say that to wound her," he said. "I know," Lady Augusta said. "That is rather the trouble with you, Julian. You never mean to wound anyone. You simply proceed as though the people around you require nothing you are not already providing, and you call the wreckage that follows an accident, when it was, every time, a choice." Julian said nothing to that. He sat for a long while after his aunt had gone up, in the particular stillness of a man who has just been handed an account of himself he cannot dispute, and it was very late that night, walking the corridor past Eleanor's rooms on his way to his own, that he stopped outside her door for the second time that month and did not knock, because he did not yet know what he would say if she answered, and a man who does not know what he means does the coward's kindness and stays silent. He would not stay silent forever, but it would take a document, first, to make him understand what silence had already cost. The document that mattered had been sitting in the Rendlesham archive for 11 years, misfiled between a survey of the deer park and a correspondence about drainage rates that no one had opened since the old Duke's clerk retired. Eleanor found it in November, 3 weeks after the culverts were cleared, while she was doing precisely the sort of work no one had asked her to do, reconciling the estate's rent roll against the actual receipts recorded in the steward's daybook, out of nothing more than the habit her father had drilled into her, that numbers which do not match are numbers that are lying to someone. The numbers did not match, not by a great deal, not at first glance, a shilling here, £3 there, nothing that would alarm a steward accustomed to rounding. But Eleanor had been raised to distrust small discrepancies precisely because they were small enough to hide behind, and when she totalled the gaps across 4 years of rent collections on the tenancies elders Creed had, by long custom, been permitted to collect personally on the estate's behalf, a courtesy extended to him as family, since he had no land of his own worth managing, the total came to £112, unaccounted for, and rising each year. She did not go to Julian with it immediately. She had learned enough of her husband by November to know that an accusation against his cousin, delivered without proof thick enough to be undeniable, would be received as a suspicion of her own motives before it was received as a fact about Creed's. So, She went instead to the archive and spent 4 evenings by candlelight going through boxes no one had opened in a decade. And it was in the 4th box that she found the trust deed. It had been drawn up by the old Duke 6 years before his death, establishing a modest fund, £300, invested and left to accrue, earmarked specifically for tenant relief in the event of enclosure losses on the common land at the eastern boundary, land the old Duke had enclosed against considerable local anger and had in apparent recompense. Quietly set this money aside to compensate the families who lost their grazing rights. The deed had never been executed. A later letter in Creed's hand informed the estate's solicitor that the old Duke had rescinded the trust shortly before his death, verbally, with no witness but Creed himself, and that the funds had accordingly been folded back into general estate revenue, from which Eleanor's reconciliation now showed clearly £112 had subsequently vanished into accounts that led, by a route requiring only a modest amount of patience to trace, back to Aldous Creed's own quarterly allowance from the estate, an allowance considerably larger than his official stipend accounted for. She sat with the deed and the letter side by side for a long time that night. Then she did something she had not done since her mother died, she allowed herself, for exactly as long as it took the candle beside her to burn down 1 inch, which she judged at perhaps 20 minutes, to feel the full weight of what this meant, that a man had died and left a promise to his poorest tenants, and his own nephew had quietly buried it and pocketed the difference for 6 years, while calling himself in every drawing-room in the county a gentleman. Then she closed the drawer on that feeling too, and began, with the same care she had brought to the culverts, to build her case. It was Priscilla Wren who gave her the piece she needed to make it undeniable, though neither of them knew, when they first spoke, that this was what the conversation would become. Mrs. Wren was a young widow of modest means, her late husband's debts considerably larger than his estate, and she had spent the autumn the subject of considerable county gossip, owing to her frequent appearances at Aldous Creed's side, and more damagingly, at Julian's, appearances Eleanor now understood. Having pieced together the timing, had been arranged by Creed himself, who had introduced Mrs. Wren to Julian's circle that very autumn, and had made certain, on the day of the garden reception, that she was seated where the departing guests would see her deep in conversation with the Duke during the very hour his wife stood waiting in the drive. Eleanor called on her directly, without warning, on a grey afternoon in late November, and found a woman who looked, on opening her own door, considerably more frightened than the situation seemed to warrant for a simple social call. "Your Grace, Mrs." Wren said. "I did not expect, I imagine you did not," Eleanor said. "May I come in? I have not come to quarrel with you, Mrs. Wren, whatever you may have been told to expect from me." They sat in a small parlour that smelled faintly of damp, in a house too fine for a widow with no income, and too shabby for the appearance Mrs. Wren was clearly straining to maintain, and Eleanor said plainly what she had come to say. "I know Mr. Creed arranged your late husband's debts to be quietly extended rather than called in some months ago. I know he has since asked things of you in return. I have not come to judge which of those things you agreed to. I have come to ask what he asked of you on the day of my garden reception, and I will tell you plainly that I already know a good portion of the answer, so there is very little use in telling me less than the truth." Mrs. Wren was quiet for a moment. "He told me to be seen with the Duke," she said finally. "Nothing more than that. To stand near him, to be noticed near him, particularly by anyone likely to repeat it. He said it would help settle a family matter. He did not say what matter, and I did not ask, because asking Mr. Creed questions has never once improved my situation with him. And the 2 hours my husband spent in his estate office that afternoon, over a hedge dispute, Eleanor said. Do you know anything of that? I know there is no hedge dispute, Mrs. Wren said. There has not been one in living memory on that boundary. I heard him say as much to his own man, laughing the week before the reception, that the Duke would sit still for an hour over a fence so long as it was framed as his tenants' trouble rather than his own family's. Eleanor sat with that for a moment. It was, she found, less painful to hear now than it would have been in the drive that afternoon, because she was no longer receiving it as a wound. She was receiving it as evidence. And evidence, unlike wounds, could be filed. Will you say that before witnesses, if it becomes necessary? Eleanor said. It was not quite a question either. Mrs. Wren looked at her for a long moment, and something in her face, fear, calculation, and beneath both, a tiredness that had clearly been accumulating for longer than one autumn, resolved into something steadier. If you can promise me, mister, Creed's debts against my husband's estate will not be the price of it, she said, then yes. I have wanted to say it for some time. I did not think anyone would believe a widow over a duke's own cousin. I am not asking you to be believed over him, Eleanor said. I am asking you to be one voice among several who happen, independently, to be telling the same truth. That is a different thing, and a much harder thing to dismiss. They came to an agreement in 20 minutes that took Creed 6 years to build a lie sturdy enough to require dismantling. Eleanor left with a name, a date, and a promise, and walked home in the grey afternoon with the particular lightness of a woman who has just watched a wall she thought permanent turn out to be built of paper after all. Julian's own accounting came before the county's did, and it came without her asking for it, which was, in its way, the first proof that something in him had genuinely shifted rather than merely bent under pressure. He found her in the estate office on a December evening, going over the reconciled rent rolls by candlelight, with the trust deed and Creed's letter laid side by side on the desk. And instead of asking what she was doing there, which was the question he would have asked in October, he asked what she had found. She told him. All of it, the £112, the trust never executed, the letter with no witness but the man who benefited from it, Mrs. Wren's account of the hedge dispute that did not exist. She told it plainly, without embellishment, the way she would have presented any set of figures, because she had learned that the truth needed no help from her feelings to be devastating on its own. Julian did not speak for a long time after she finished. He stood at the window with his back to her, in the particular stillness of a man absorbing a loss larger than money, and when he finally turned around his face, had none of the composure he usually kept arranged there. He told me, that day, Julian said, that you would not mind waiting, that you were not the sort of woman who required to be managed carefully. I believed him because it was easier to believe than to examine why a man I trusted would want me kept in a room for 2 hours on the one day my wife most needed me elsewhere. You did not need him to convince you of anything, Eleanor said. You already believed I would manage. You have believed it since the day we married. That is not a flaw in Mr. Creed's character, Julian. That is a fact about yours. And I would rather you own it honestly than blame it on a man clever enough to exploit a door you had already left open. He absorbed that. He did not argue it, which she noted, quietly, as the first thing in 6 months of marriage that felt like real progress rather than performed apology. I said you were suitable, he said, that afternoon, through the door. I did not know you heard it. I heard it, Eleanor said. I gave myself 10 minutes to feel what it meant, and then I put it away, because I had a reception to host and no time that day to be anything but useful to myself. 10 minutes, Julian said, and something in his voice cracked slightly on the words. Not quite a question, closer to disbelief that a wound of that size could be rationed so precisely. I do not have the luxury of feeling things for as long as they deserve, Eleanor said. My mother taught me that before she died. A woman's grief, unrationed, becomes a room she cannot find her way out of. I have found it useful since to know exactly how long I intend to stay in any room before I decide to leave it. Julian looked at her for a long moment, and it was in that look, more than in anything he said next, that she saw the beginning of the man Lady Augusta had described, the boy who had learned to ask nothing of anyone so that nothing could be taken from him, beginning, finally, to understand that the lesson had cost him everything it was meant to protect. I do not know how to ask for more than suitable, he said finally. I was never taught it. I am asking you to teach me, if you are willing, though I understand I have given you very little reason to be. That, Eleanor said, is the first true thing you have said to me since the day we married. She did not tell him yet that she forgave him. She was not certain, that evening, that forgiveness was the correct word for what she felt, which was closer to a cautious willingness to see what he would do next, now that he had finally admitted there was a next to be done. She rose and closed the trust deed into her writing box, the same box that had sat on her knees in the drive, and she did not lock it, and left it, deliberately, open on the desk between them. You may look at anything in it, she said. I have kept nothing from you that concerns this house. I would ask, in return, that you keep nothing from me either, starting now. Julian looked at the open box for a long moment, at the ledgers and letters inside it that represented, more plainly than anything he could have said aloud, the whole of what she had built without his help while he sat in rooms discussing hedges. All right, he said. All right, then, Eleanor said, and something in the exchange settled between them the way a foundation settles once a house has finally been built on level ground. The quarter sessions fell, that year, on a cold, bright day in mid-December, and it was there, before the assembled tenants of Milestone and the magistrate who oversaw the parish's disputes, that the truth of Aldous Creed's 6 years found its audience. Eleanor had not asked Julian to arrange it as a trial of his cousin. She had asked, simply, that the estate's tenant relief accounts be reviewed publicly this year rather than settled quietly behind closed doors, as they had been every year since the old Duke's death, and Julian, understanding now precisely what that request would uncover, had agreed to it without flinching, which was itself a measure of how far he had come since October. The village hall was full. Tenants, freeholders, the parish clergyman, Sir Edmund Vale presiding as magistrate with the particular patience of a man who had adjudicated boundary disputes and poaching cases for 30 years and expected nothing more dramatic from this session than the usual grumbling over rents. Creed sat near the front, composed, faintly amused. The way a man sits who does not yet know the ground beneath him has already been surveyed and found hollow. Eleanor rose when Sir Edmund called for the tenant relief accounts and laid the reconciled rolls before him, with the trust deed beside them. 6 years ago, she said, the late Duke of Rendlesham set aside £300 for the relief of tenants who lost common grazing at the eastern enclosure. That trust was never executed. I should like to ask Mr. Creed, who informed the estate's solicitor that his uncle rescinded it verbally in his final illness, precisely when that conversation took place, and who else was present to witness it. Creed's composure did not crack immediately. It rarely does, in men who have practiced it as long as he had. "I have told this story before," he said. "My uncle spoke to me privately, in his last weeks. There was no one else present. That is hardly unusual in a man's final illness." "It is not unusual," Eleanor agreed. "What is unusual is that the letter recording this conversation is dated the 14th of March, and your uncle's own physician's daily notes, which I obtained from Dr. Aldridge this week, record him as insensible with fever from the 11th of March until his death on the 19th. I would be glad to hear how a dying man insensible with fever managed to rescind, with such perfect legal clarity, a trust he had taken 6 years to establish." There was a stillness in the hall of the particular kind that follows a question no one in the room expects to be answered honestly. Creed opened his mouth and closed it, and Sir Edmund, whose patience for boundary disputes did not extend to men caught altering the record of a dying man's final wishes, leaned forward with considerably more interest than he had brought to the session an hour before. "Perhaps," Eleanor said, into the silence, Mr. Creed would care to explain, in that case, the source of the additional £40 a year that has appeared in his personal allowance since the year this letter was written, drawn from an estate account that shows a corresponding shortfall in tenant relief disbursements of remarkably similar size. It was at this point that Tom Rigg, a tenant farmer of no particular standing, who had lost 11 acres of grazing in the eastern enclosure, and had been told, 6 years running, that no relief fund existed to compensate him, rose unbidden from the back of the hall. "Begging pardon, your grace, sir," he said to the magistrate, twisting his hat in his hands the way working men do when they have decided to speak and are still surprised at themselves for it. "But I asked Mr. Creed himself, 3 winters back, whether there weren't some fund set aside for the likes of us who lost the common land. He told me there weren't none, and never had been, and that I ought to be grateful the estate hadn't raised my rent besides. I've a receipt somewhere for the year my hay came up short on account of it, if the court would want it." 2 more tenants stood after him, each with a small piece of the same story. A denial here, a rent adjustment there that made sense only if the missing trust had, in fact, existed and been quietly withheld. It was not, in the end, Eleanor's ledgers alone that undid Aldous Creed. It was the accumulation of ordinary men, unasked, standing to say what had actually happened to them, against a story that had survived only as long as no one thought to compare it against the facts of their own lives. Creed's composure did, finally, break, not into anger, but into something smaller and more telling, a kind of deflation, the air going out of 6 years of careful performance all at once. "I needed the money," he said, quietly, to no one in particular, and it was the first true thing he had said in the hall all day. "I have needed it for years. I told myself the trust would have been wasted on men who would only have drunk it away by spring." "That was not your decision to make," Sir Edmund said, not unkindly, but with the particular firmness of a man closing a matter he had heard quite enough of. "The relief fund will be reinstated in full, with interest calculated from the date it should have been disbursed, and the shortfall in your personal allowance will be recovered against your future income from the estate, if His Grace chooses to continue extending you one at all." All eyes turned, at that, to Julian, who had sat through the entire proceeding in a silence Eleanor recognised now as something other than his old coldness, the silence of a man watching, with something between grief and relief, the woman he had called merely suitable dismantle a 6-year deception with nothing but arithmetic and the willingness of frightened men to finally speak. "He will have his allowance," Julian said, as family, and nothing more. He will have no further part in the management of any account on this estate ever again. It was mercy, dispensed from a position that could easily have chosen otherwise, and the room understood it as such. Understood, too, watching Julian look at his wife across the hall with an expression the county had never before seen on the Duke of Rendlesham's face, that something considerably larger than a rent-roll discrepancy had just been settled in that room. The explanation, when it finally came in full, came not in the hall but 3 nights later, in the quiet of the estate office, with the fire burned low, and the county's gossip about the quarter sessions already 3 days old, and cooling into legend. "I want to tell you the whole of it," Julian said. "Not the version I have given you in pieces, all of it, so you may judge the whole, rather than forgive fragments you have had to piece together yourself." "I would rather have the whole of it," Eleanor said. "An apology I can accept easily enough. An explanation is worth considerably more, and I notice you have given me a great many apologies these last weeks, and remarkably few explanations." He told her then about his mother, the trunk, the note his father burned, the particular silence that followed her leaving, a silence the old Duke had enforced so thoroughly that Julian had not heard his mother's name spoken aloud in that house for nearly 2 decades. He told her about the ledger of liabilities his father had described attachment as, and how faithfully he had kept that ledger himself, entering nothing on the side that might one day cost him. He told her, too, about the 2 hours in the estate office, not merely that Creed had manufactured the hedge dispute, but that some part of him, hearing his aunt's warning through the door, had chosen to finish the conversation anyway, because finishing it was a duty with a clear edge to it, and going to his wife was a feeling with no edge at all. And he had spent 31 years trusting edges over feelings, because edges, unlike people, did not leave. "I am not telling you this to be excused," he said. "My father's doctrine explains why I built the wall. It does not excuse that I kept building it, year after year, against a woman who never once gave me cause to think she required walls to be kept safe from her." Eleanor listened to all of it without interrupting, the way she listened to a ledger being read aloud before she decided which figures to question, and when he finished she was quiet for a long moment. "Apology and explanation are different things," she said finally. "You have given me both tonight, and I want you to understand I have noticed the difference, because a great many people confuse the two and expect the second to stand in for the first. It will not, on its own. But I have had both from you now, which is more than I expected to have this year." "Then tell me your terms," Julian said. "I would rather know exactly what is required of me than guess and fail again." She had, in fact, thought about this for some time, in the way she thought about everything, carefully, and in writing, though she did not need the paper in front of her to recite it. "I will keep the estate's accounts openly, with my name beside yours in the books, not folded into yours, as though my work were merely an extension of your authority," she said. "I will have full charge of the home farm and its tenants, without needing your permission sought first for improvements I judge sound. I will not mediate between you and your family's silences any longer. If you have something to say to Lady Augusta, or to the memory of your mother, you will say it yourself, and not ask me to carry messages you are too proud to deliver in person. And I will not again be left standing anywhere, for any reason, without a word sent to tell me why, however urgent the hedge." "There was never a hedge," Julian said, and something in the observation, delivered so flatly after everything else, drew from her the first genuine laugh she had allowed herself in his company in 6 months of marriage, short, surprised, entirely involuntary. Julian looked at her as though she had handed him something considerably more valuable than an apology. "All right," he said. "All right, then," Eleanor said, and the echo of it, this time, felt less like a treaty being signed, and more like one already long in force being finally acknowledged aloud. There remained one apology owed that was not Julian's to give, and it came, awkwardly and at some length, from Lady Augusta, who called on Eleanor privately the week after Christmas and said, without much preamble, that she was sorry, not for the sentence spoken through the drawing-room door, which she had not authored, but for having stood beside it and said nothing, for 30 years of watching Hartwell men build walls and calling it, out of old family habit, merely their nature rather than their choice. "I should have told him, long before you arrived to tell him yourself," Lady Augusta said, "that his mother did not leave because she was owed too little attention. She left because she was given none, and mistaken for years in the giving of it for a woman who required nothing. I let that mistake stand because it was easier than admitting my own brother had made it, and I am sorry for the years it cost you both. You are the first person in this family to say it required correcting rather than merely explaining," Eleanor said. "I will accept that as the apology it is, Lady Augusta. And I will ask only that you say as much to Julian directly, some day soon, rather than leaving him to learn the whole shape of his mother's leaving second-hand, the way he has learned everything else about her." Lady Augusta promised she would, and did, some weeks later, in a conversation Eleanor was not present for, and never asked about, because some things, she had come to believe, belonged to the people who needed to say them to each other directly, and a wife's authority did not extend to standing witness over every reckoning in her husband's family. The winter that followed was not dramatic. This, Eleanor came to think, was rather the point of it. It showed itself in small accumulations that meant, individually, almost nothing. The chair Julian began, without comment, drawing up beside hers in the estate office of an evening, rather than sitting across the desk from her, as though she were a steward to be consulted, rather than a wife to sit beside. The tea he began pouring for her before she asked, remembering, unprompted, that she preferred it with the milk added after rather than before, a detail she had mentioned exactly once, in October, and had not expected him to retain. The ledger he began sharing rather than merely permitting her access to, asking her opinion on entries before he had finished forming his own, which was, for a man raised to treat every judgment as his to make alone, a considerably larger surrender than it sounded. None of it, taken alone, would have convinced her of anything. It was the accumulation that did the convincing, the way a house is not judged sound by any single beam, but by the pattern of all of them holding, together, over time. There was one relapse, in February, that tested whether the change was real or merely performed for an audience she had stopped being. A tenant dispute arose over a boundary hedge, a real one, this time, with real thorns, and a genuine disagreement about where the old line had run, and Julian, out of 30 years of habit, handled it alone, in the estate office, without telling her, and settled it quietly before she even knew it had existed as a problem. She found out 3 days later, from Dunmore, in the flat, unbothered tone of a man reporting weather. She did not raise her voice. She found Julian in the estate office that evening, and set down, with great and deliberate gentleness, the cup of tea she had brought for herself, and said, "You settled the Marna boundary alone, without telling me. I would like to understand why, since I thought we had agreed there would be no more of that." Julian looked, for a moment, genuinely caught, in the particular way a man looks when an old habit has resurfaced without his noticing it happen. "It was small," he said. "I did not think it required troubling you with. That is precisely the reasoning you used about the hedge that never existed," Eleanor said. "I am not troubled by small disputes, Julian. I am troubled by being told, again, after everything, that some things are simply handled without me, because handling things without me was so long your habit that you no longer notice yourself doing it." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, to his credit, he did not defend himself. "You are right," he said. "I did it out of habit, not out of any decision that you should be excluded. That is not much better an excuse, I know. I will not do it again, and if I find myself doing it, I would rather you tell me plainly, the way you have just done, than let it pass unremarked." "That," Eleanor said, "is all I am asking." It was a small correction, in the end, and it cost them one uncomfortable evening rather than a season of silence, which told her, more than any declaration could have, that whatever had shifted in him that autumn had shifted structurally rather than merely for show. The declaration itself, when it came in March, on an ordinary evening with no reception, no audience, and no crisis to force it out of him. "I have been trying to think how to say this in words my father would not have approved of," Julian said. "He would have called it an unwise entry in a ledger better left blank. I find, lately, that I no longer care what he would have approved of." Eleanor waited. She had learned, by now, that Julian's silences before speaking were not evasions, but a kind of careful drafting, and that the sentence, when it came, would be one he had genuinely meant to write. "I would choose you," he said. "Not because the contract requires it, and not because the county now expects it of me, having watched you undo my cousin with nothing but arithmetic and honest men. I would choose you if I had met you with no dowry attached and no estate to save. I think, in truth, I have been choosing you for some months now, in the small ways, and simply lacked the courage to say the whole of it aloud until I was certain I would not lose my nerve halfway through the sentence." "That is not the sentence you spoke through the drawing-room door," Eleanor said, quietly. "No," Julian said. "It is not. I said once that you were suitable, and that I required nothing more of you than that. I was a coward when I said it, and worse than a coward, because I believed it protected you, when it did nothing but tell you I had not yet troubled to look. You are not suitable, Eleanor. You are the reason this house has stopped feeling like a place I merely occupy. I require everything of you that a man requires of the person he has finally understood he loves, and I am sorry it took a cousin's fraud and a magistrate's session to teach me the difference." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. She found, to her own mild surprise, that she did not reach for the drawer in her mind where she filed things away to be felt later, in rationed minutes. She let this feeling arrive whole, uncounted, the first time in years she had allowed herself to do so, and found that the room did not close around her the way she had always feared it would. "All right," she said, and her voice for once was not entirely steady. "All right, then," Julian said, and reached for her hand, and this time she did not merely permit it. She held on. 2 years later, the low meadow at Rendlesham had not flooded once, and the eastern boundary tenants received their relief payments each Michaelmas from a fund that now bore. At the parish clergyman's quiet insistence, the old Duke's name properly restored to it. Aldous Creed lived at a modest distance in the north, on an allowance sufficient to keep him from want, and insufficient to keep him from remembering, daily, precisely what he had traded that money for. Priscilla Wren, freed of the debts Creed had used to bind her, had opened a small millinery in the county town with a loan Eleanor arranged quietly and never spoke of publicly, and was, by all accounts, prospering, and had stopped, some while ago, being spoken of in the county as anyone's pawn. Tom Rigg's testimony at the quarter sessions had earned him, eventually, the tenancy of the largest farm on the eastern boundary, awarded on merit rather than favour, though everyone understood the two were, in his case, the same thing. Silas Dunmore still managed the estate, though he now did so with the Duchess's ledgers laid open beside his own each quarter day, a practice he had once have called an insult to his judgment, and had come, in time, to call simply good sense. The writing-box that had sat on Eleanor's knees in the drive that terrible bright afternoon now sat, permanently, on the wide desk in the estate office, no longer hers alone but shared, its brass clasp worn smooth from use by 2 hands rather than 1. Its ledgers, now recording not a woman's private accounting of a husband's absence, but a household's open record of its own slow, ordinary repair, where it had once meant a woman keeping her own counsel because no one else would keep it for her. It had come to mean something nearer the opposite. 2 people who had learned, at considerable cost, to keep nothing from each other that either might need. Rendlesham Park, in the 2 years since that garden reception, had become known through Milestone as a house that had finally stopped holding its breath, a phrase the tenants used, without much ceremony, to describe the particular ease that had settled over its rooms, the way a house exhales once the people in it have stopped bracing for the next silence. She had not been made a duchess by a title, and she had not been made one either by the day she walked 3 miles home in slippers and said nothing to anyone about why. She had been made one, if the word meant anything at all, by refusing to be classified as merely useful and waiting, with terrible patience, for the world around her to correct its arithmetic. She had stopped asking to be seen. She had made herself, through nothing but ledgers, culverts, and the plain, unglamorous labour of telling the truth on paper when no one else would, impossible to unsee. And that, she had come to understand, was not a thing any man, however cold, however sorry, could ever again take from her.